Writing and Thinking. Book 1, A Handbook of Composition. Chapter 1, Sentences and Thinking. Part 1, Thought and Expression. Writing and thinking are organically related to each other. This fact is at the heart of the problem of literary composition. The problem confronting a person who sits down to write may be stated very simply. Given a thought or a feeling, required words that will express this thought or feeling and convey it to the reader unchanged. A solution may be stated just as simply. The words required for the expression of the thought or feeling are the words intended in the thought or feeling itself. They are not cunningly devised by the writer, intended and arranged by him with a view to impress the reader. He does nothing but find them in the place where they spring to life, i.e., in the mind. Writing, in other words, should be organic, not mechanic. Quote, "The form is mechanics," says Coleridge, "when on any given material we impress a predetermined form," end quote, as when the gardener trims a cedar tree in order to force it into an unnatural form of a pyramid. Quote, "The organic form, on the other hand, is innate. It shapes as it develops itself from within, and the fullness of its form is one and the same with the perfection of its outward form. Such as the life is, such is the form. Nature, the prime genial artist, inexhaustible in diverse powers, is equally inexhaustible in forms. Each exterior is the physiognomy of a being within, its true image," end quote. Granted a favorable environment, the tree as nature makes it, the cedar, the pine, the oak, the willow, assumes its proper shape as it develops itself from within. The mature tree is already implicit in the seed. In the acorn resides the grandeur of an oak. The kernel idea attains its necessary expression in the mature organism. It is the same when the artist is not nature, but man. Shakespeare in Macbeth, Keats in his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address, did not plan their compositions with rule and compass and cleverly arrange words, did not work mechanically, but having a given idea to express, they allowed it to grow from within, nourishing it with mental and spiritual attention till it was ready to issue as a work of art. Since they worked organically, the resulting form became the only possible form of their particular thought that they had. Quote, "Such as the life is, such is the form," end quote. Assuming that they completely expressed what they meant to express, we may say that they could not alter, and that we could not alter, a single word without expressing something else. Strictly speaking, the only way of explaining what a literary composition contains is to repeat it word for word. The poem, the address, means what it says, and nothing else. This is equally true of the whole and every part. We cannot adequately paraphrase a single line, give its meaning in other words than the author employed. Does Shakespeare's line, "To be or not to be, that is the question," mean exactly the same as, "To exist or not exist, which is preferable," or "Shall I end my life," or even, "Shall I commit suicide"? Does the first of these mean no more than the last? Does it not, for one thing, contain more feeling? Again, to make another example, does Pope's line, "Hope springs eternal in the human breast," contain the very same thought as, "Hope is deeply rooted in man," or "Man is never without hope," or "Men are always hopeful," or even "People never stop hoping"? No doubt the meanings are closely similar, but they are not identical, and could not be unless the words were identical. There are not various ways of saying the same thing, and what is true of paraphrase is true of translation. Speaking of foreign classics, Thoreau says that he must read them in the original because there are no translations. There are so-called quote-unquote translations, to be sure, but on account of the organic unity of thought and expression, they necessarily fail to reproduce exactly the author's meaning. The only way to read Homer is to read Homer, not Pope's translation or Bryant's, or any other. For a good book, as Milton says, is, quote, "the precious lifeblood of a master spirit," end quote, to be known only by direct communication. As it is impossible to paraphrase, as it is impossible to translate, so once more it is impossible to reproduce an author's style. Style, it has often been said, is the man himself. By this is usually meant that each man's manner of expression is a reflection of his individuality, of that in him which renders him different from all other men, and which renders him imitable. The only way to write like Addison or Burke or Carlyle is to be Addison, Burke, or Carlyle. Within certain important limits, which we shall consider presently, each writer must achieve his own personal manner of expression by his own style, reflected in his personal mode of thought and feeling. He does not think and feel precisely like any other man, and consequently he should not write precisely like any other man. He should be original in the right sense of the word, obedient to his vision of truth and beauty, never in the false sense of posing for what he is not, cultivating a superficial oddity. Writing and thinking, then, are merely two aspects of the same thing, whether we refer to the whole poem, a short story, or expository article, or to its constituent sentences. What is a sentence? It is a group of words expressing a complete thought or feeling. It must express a thought, one thought, not part of a thought, nor more than a thought. Thus, when a student wrote, "observing and obeying his laws," he wrote a sentence which is obviously only part of a thought. It should have been joined with the rest of his thought. Milton believed that man should be humble, obedient, and thankful towards God, observing and obeying his laws. That is a complete thought, if rather ill-expressed thought. Again, when another student wrote, "At last, late in September, constant bombardments forced the surrender of Warsaw, where I spent my vacation 6 years ago," he wrote a sentence what is plainly more than a complete thought. Quote, "where I spent my vacation 6 years ago," end quote, is irrelevant addition to the thought and should be struck out or included where it does fit. The fundamental requirement of the sentence is that it expresses one complete thought, neither more nor less, or, as the grammarians say, it must have unity. Remembering, then, that a sentence must contain but one complete thought, we constantly face the perplexing question, precisely what group of words will express this thought. Only the writer can answer with certainty, and he only when he has fully mastered his thought. Even the best writers are inclined to set down groups of words before they have mastered their thought, so that their expression is more or less distorted, does not quite faithfully reflect their thought, and inferior writers are almost steadily satisfied with words that will quote-unquote do, words that will roughly represent the thought and perhaps merely hint at it. When we read a sentence that is vague and feeble, we may safely assume that the writer's thought was vague and feeble. When we read a sentence that is clear and strong, we may be sure that the writer's thought was clear and strong. Quote, "A sentence should read as if the author had held a plow instead of a pen, could have drawn a furrow deep and straight to the end." End quote. It will not do to excuse oneself by saying that one has a thought but cannot express it. If one really has it, possesses it, one can express it readily enough, since it will virtually express itself. When a sentence imperfectly represents a writer's intention, the thing to do is either to rewrite it entirely, seeking afresh the group of words that matches the thought, or to revise it, altering the words or their arrangement until the result is a fully expressed thought. Success depends on one's ability to recollect the thought, or to perceive it even more vividly than at first. The student who will exert himself to rewrite or revise in this spirit need never humiliate himself by confessing that he does not know what he means. To write expressive sentences, therefore, we are to lean on the thought, derive from it the power of utterance. The sentence is an organism, of which the soul is the thought, and the body the words. It is an embodied thought. Yet it would be fatal for the student of composition to assume, from the foregoing explanation of the organic nature of the sentence, that all the rules of syntax and rhetoric are superfluous, that he need merely contemplate his thoughts and depend upon them for the sentences that will convey them to other men. For, after all, the sentence organism has certain definite laws that may be learned and applied. While it is true that the thought determines the expression, that my thought requires my expression, it is also true, happily, that in the main all men think alike. Style, as we have said, is the man, but style is also man. We are all individuals, but individuals of the same species. Broadly speaking, our thoughts are those of all other men. If they were not, other men could not understand us. Even more, no doubt, our ways of thinking, the logical modes in which our minds work, are human rather than personal. And while the personal element in expression may safely be trusted to take care of itself, this impersonal element requires of us a severe discipline. We have a choice, indeed, between two disciplines. We may make our writing human rather than merely individual, in the first place, as many of the great writers have done, by reading widely and intensively in the works of the masters of English prose, by familiarizing ourselves with the modes of expression of successful craftsmen like Addison and Burke and Thackeray, and the leading writers of our time, till at last we attain an intimate sense of the principles of expression and finding ourselves, unconsciously perhaps, applying these principles to our own writing. There is no better or more delightful way of learning to write than this, but it depends on a vast amount of reading. Most of us will prefer to combine this method with the second discipline. That is, we shall read as much as our time permits, and seek our own discipline in the study and practice of rhetoric. The technique of writing, as expounded by the grammarians and rhetoricians, is not an arbitrary statement of opinion, but, far otherwise, a codification of the habitual usage of the best writers. Rhetoric aims to formulate the universally valid principles of expression, to tell how it is in the nature of the human mind to express itself in language. As the natural sciences seek to define the laws of physical nature, so rhetoric seeks to define the laws of expression in relation to thought. In the following pages, it will be our task to study and apply some of the most important of these laws, and first, the law of subordination.